I'm Marisa Lenhardt, and I am super excited to tell you about the adventures of the Van Buren sisters. The Van Buren sisters were riding motorcycles across the United States. The whole ride had been challenging. They had repeatedly dumped their bikes in dirt, gotten stuck in muddy ruts, and directions were minimal and came in the form of vague descriptions in the summer of 1916. And despite Adeline being in her late 20s and Augusta being in her early 30s, headline after headline after headline repeatedly referred to them as girls. But nothing was more dire than when, in Skull Valley, Utah, oh, I didn't know that was one. 100 miles west of Salt Lake City, they nearly ran out of fuel. That had happened a few times before, but this time, during a summer heat wave that had caused deaths across the country, miles from anywhere and in one of the most inhospitable landscapes imaginable, they also ran out of water. The trip, initially slated to end in early August, had already been extended by several weeks. On a road that even today warns of a lack of services, they knew they could not afford to head in the wrong direction. So they abandoned their bikes and struck out into the wilds of Utah. Let's go back. Warning, in addition to many references to grown women as girls, this talk also features a lot of references to a motorcycle company called Indian, as well as white feminism. So, how did two sisters in the early 20th century, when the idea of two women undertaking such a journey was unthinkable, manage this trip? Like all good US citizens, they pulled themselves up by their bootstraps. Is that not Shit. The Van Buren sisters were born into it. Augusta was born March 26th of 1884, and Adeline was born July 26th of 1889. They were society women, descendants of the 8th President of the United States, Martin Van Buren. And they were born and raised in New York and had a new hobby each year: canoeing, swimming, boxing, wrestling. They began motorcycling in 1913, and by 1916, Adeline said that riding had supplanted all other sports and now reigns supreme as it has for 3 years. This was after 3 years of riding in New York City traffic. That's what it looked like then. So the sisters planned their cross-country trip with two goals. The first was to prove that women could endure the trip, making them capable wartime dispatch riders. Dispatch riding was serious business. The job involved riding muddy roads in the dark, often under fire. Navigation was inaccurate, communication was complicated, and riders were prime targets as they often carried battlefield operational knowledge. That said, the job was considered prime, as it was highly paid and brought riders into contact with high-ranking officers. The second goal of the ride was to distribute literature about the preparedness movement. The preparedness movement was started by Theodore Roosevelt to convince the United States of the need to be involved in worldly affairs. The sisters were especially interested in this because acting as dispatch riders would free up men for combat, and women not participating in combat was one of the arguments against giving women the right to vote. So while all women in the United States were technically allowed to vote by 1920, voting wouldn't become a reality for many black women until the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which outlawed discriminatory voting practices, and as you can see, it is now working perfectly. Back to the 20th century. Augusta and Adeline were not the first women to cross the country by motorcycle. That honor went to Avis and Effie Hotchkiss, a mother and daughter duo who the previous year completed a 9,000-mile round trip from New York to San Francisco and back on a Harley Davidson with a sidecar. The Van Burens were to be the first pair of women to complete the trip, each on their own motorcycle. So they acquired Indian Power Plus V-twin bikes, which cost $275 each, $7,500 in today's dollars. The 3-speed 998cc bikes had a top speed of 65 miles an hour, acetylene headlights, and no front brakes. Modern-day riders know that this is horrifying because approximately 70% of braking takes place on modern bikes is handled by the front brake. If not all of it, I see you. Still, it was an improvement over motorcycles prior to 1902, where the braking system was slow down and put a foot out. There was a flurry of press coverage leading up to their departure, and they partnered with Motorcycle Illustrated magazine to submit stories about their journey in advance and along the way. The Van Burens left Brooklyn's Sheepshead Bay racetrack on July 5th, 1916, 4 days into the Battle of the Somme in France. Clad in goggles and head to toe in leather, the sisters set out with the goal of arriving in San Francisco by August 9th, taking the train back in time for Adeline to continue her teaching duties in September. Many of their stops were dictated by their partnerships and photo ops with Indian Motorcycles and Firestone Tires. So their first day, after a rainy ride from New York, they stopped in Springfield, Massachusetts, visiting the factory where their motorcycles had been made. Their third day, from Schenectady to Buffalo, was at 300 miles, the longest stretch of their trip, despite the fact that Augusta was knocked off her motorcycle by a horse that day. Leaving the Firestone factory in Akron, Adeline said, "With a motorcycle, all roads lead to the end of the world if one has but the courage to follow them." It's not even the end quote, it's just a good quote. Almost as good as when they finally made it to Indiana, Adeline said, "Indiana seemed to us to be a state of small farmlands peopled by humans who have lost the enthusiasm of life." I am sorry if you're from Indiana, but you're here now, so we support you. They were in Clinton, Iowa on July 22nd when a damper was put on their mission. The Preparedness Day parade in San Francisco was bombed. At the 51,000 person parade on the west side of Stewart Street, south of Market, about 450 feet from the Ferry Building, a time bomb went off. 10 people were killed and 40 were injured in what remains to this day the worst terrorist attack in San Francisco history. The sisters' resolve to champion their cause was hardened. They left Iowa in the middle of a record-breaking heat wave, heading across the Missouri River and into Omaha. At the Omaha Bicycle Company, they had their motorcycles lowered, enabling the sisters to reach the ground with their feet while sitting in the saddles. It's a wonder that they made it that far without being able to do that. This certainly helped them to make history as they proceeded to Pikes Peak. On August 5th, 1916, Augusta and Adeline Van Buren became the first women to ascend Pikes Peak on their own motorcycles. The ride is a challenging one. Yes. Oh, sorry. The ride is a challenging one even today, and it was a harrowing undertaking that few had previously achieved at the time. Of this accomplishment, the sisters told the Colorado Springs newspaper that we didn't really feel that we had achieved anything wonderful until yesterday. We did not really become elated until we mounted Pikes Peak. Now we know we have really done a wonderful thing. Yeah. The sisters ascended the peak 5 days before the inaugural Pikes Peak hill climb on August 10th, 1916. This run now takes place annually on the last weekend of June. This is Pikes Peak today. Unfortunately, since the tragic death of Carlin Dunn at the 2019 event, motorcycles are no longer allowed to participate in the Pikes Peak hill climb. The sisters' trip went downhill from there. Okay. Once they were forced to abandon their bikes in mud and walk to a nearby mining town for help, and in Grand Junction, Colorado, they were stuck for several days during a storm that washed out roads and bridges. Departing Salt Lake City on August 21st along the Pony Express Trail, it was so hot that circus elephants broke loose in Indiana in search of shade and water. In July 1916, heat had killed 115 people in Chicago, and 16 died in Gary, Indiana, where it had reached 116 earlier that month. This image was generated with AI with the description elephant chaos, so it was supposed to distract you from hearing about the deaths of hundreds of people from heat. Southwest of the Great Salt Lake, the route the sisters had been following for 80 miles disappeared. They were nearly out of gas, not enough to make it to a town, and certainly not enough to allow for any margin of error. And then they ran out of water. After all of the tribulations of the last week, so close to the end of their journey, they faced their greatest danger. All seemed lost, and the sisters knew that not only their journey, but their survival hinged on their decision. As they were weighing their options, a prospector appeared in a horse-drawn carriage. He provided water and directions, ensuring that the sisters had just enough fuel to make it to their next stop. Disaster averted, the remainder of the sisters' trip was relatively uneventful. The roads in California were well maintained. I don't know what happened. That was it. They meandered through the Central Valley and they ended up in Oakland. At this point, they had technically achieved their goal, but they wouldn't consider their mission accomplished until they made it to San Francisco. The Golden Gate and Bay Bridges weren't completed yet until the mid-1930s, so on September 2nd, the sisters took the ferry with their motorcycles to San Francisco. Oh, it's there. Thanks. Much to their disappointment, there was no reception. Motorcycle Illustrated was more excited than the residents of San Francisco, and they published about a half page about the sisters' accomplishment. Van Buren's departed San Francisco, calling it "this hick town," and they headed to Los Angeles, where they were met by a reception committee organized by Indian and Firestone. And in San Diego, they received medals at the San Diego Exposition. And in Southern California and in Mexico, they had finally received the reception that they deserved. On September 18th, they boarded the Southern Pacific Railway in Los Angeles and returned to New York, and the bikes were shipped to meet them there. It's a stretch, but I'll allow it. Despite the rumors, there is no record of the sisters ever being arrested on their trip for wearing pants, but it's the first thing you see in every internet article on this. Adeline and Augusta returned to their jobs, stenography and teaching, and in January of 1917, when the Army put out a call to motorcycle clubs urging men to prepare for possible duties in the military, Gussie and Addie Van Buren applied to serve as volunteer dispatch riders. They were turned down. I know. Adeline went on to graduate from law school, and Augusta received her pilot's license, joining Amelia Earhart's 99ers organization and flying her own plane around the country. Perhaps one of their greatest legacies were the women Adeline and Augusta empowered. Women like Bessie Stringfield, the motorcycle queen of Miami. In the 1930s, she became the first African-American woman to cross the United States solo on a motorcycle. And in the 1940s, Bessie rode her motorcycle across the United States alone on her Harley 8 times as a World War II dispatch rider for the United States Army. Adeline passed away in 1949, and Augusta passed away in 1959. In 2002, the sisters were inducted into the Motorcycle Hall of Fame. So, a toast to Addie and Gussie. Thank you for the inspiration. To all of you, may you always keep the rubber side down and be inspired by Augusta Van Buren, who said, "Woman can, if she will."